Okay, so if we want to kind of have a look here at, I suppose, moving more towards the calculating the total cost of ownership and kind of what that can look like. We've kind of touched on it or grazed over it in a couple of different things, a couple of different slides already, but we can have a look on the next slide here, where we're going to be looking at open source tools, but maybe some of the additional considerations that you might need to just look at before, I suppose, weighing up whether it's going to be open source or whether it's going to be a professional tooling. So the initial setup costs, as we mentioned, the open source, it is going to be free. So you don't have that initial licensing cost, which can be a big factor when adopting the open source tooling. However, just a few areas to touch on here with regards initial setup costs. So hardware, software, what's going to be required from that side. Ongoing costs for maintenance or hosting, again, and this kind of feeds into whether the open source tooling you're looking at is going to be a desktop application or whether it's going to be SaaS. Even if we have SoapUI here, it's a desktop application, but are you going to have to run that on a VM and have it hosted somewhere? Is it going to be on desktop? So a user's local machine. And then the resource allocation. So the resource allocation is to me one of the key elements here. So internal IT staff, who's going to be the one setting it up, who's going to be the one using the likes of SoapUI to create and run the API tests, set up the projects, and again maintain those projects as well, because as APIs grow, there's new versions, maybe different protocols. The projects that we have created might need to kind of mature. We might need to build on top of those, add new test cases, test suites. So that's where the maintenance becomes very important. And as I touched on a couple of times, we need to make sure that we have the internal staff and resources allocated that can build out those. So again, who has I suppose, the knowledge of open source tooling like SoapUI, but also who would have that kind of scripting knowledge that can maintain the tests and build on top and run them successfully. So that's a couple of the key elements, I suppose, from my side. Joe, from your side, is there any other ones you want to kind of jump in or go through?
I think a big one, and it's kind of more of maybe it's like a organizational factor or like a social factor is, when you have an open source tool being used on a team, it's often maybe being used by like one or two members of the team, but there's no like official kind of, you know, uh, what's the word? Like maybe organizational support for the tool, right? It might just be that a tester joins a team and maybe one of their team members is using, SoapUI open source already. My point is just that adoption or promoting adoption of an open source tool like that can sometimes be challenging just by nature of the fact that it's open source and there's no real kind of backing of the tool within the enterprise, which you do get with a paid tool. That's not necessarily always a bad thing. I know a lot of teams and a lot of companies, especially with their engineering function, operate kind of a, whatever tool to get the job done type of approach. So it really depends. I suppose it really depends on the engineering culture within the team, this ability to pick and choose, or every developer or tester just uses the best tool that they feel like gets the job done. That can work very well in some organizations. And then I've worked with other companies who, they prefer to have kind of a, more of a maybe managed approach where, this is the tool that we use for API testing and, we would rather you didn't use another one. So yeah, maybe more of maybe a soft challenge rather than a hard technical challenge, but definitely one that comes up from time to time, nonetheless.
Yeah, and it's something I mentioned with other tooling, teams might be using different CI tools, but yeah, it's an extremely valid point that different teams could be using different API testing tools as well. So it might not be, you might have some teams using the likes of SoapUI. You might have other teams using Ready API. Um, and again, we'll talk about, even a hybrid approach like that in a bit more detail. But then you
Mhm.
could have teams using different testing solutions from both of those. So yeah, again, like it just depends on the organization. And I've seen examples like what you mentioned, Joe, of some organizations using different approach or different tooling. Some then that try and kind of uniform that and bring it together. So there's that kind of uniformed tool that's going to be used, and that uniform testing approach.